Well, hello, and welcome back to a surprise live episode of Patristica, again with just me, your host, Jack Bull. And I'm hoping to do something that the channel doesn't really do very often, namely a response video to a recent debate that happened on a channel called the Apologetic Dog between Dr. James White and Joe Heschmeyer, in which they discussed the origins of the Catholic liturgy and tried to wrestle it out as to whether or not we could trace the Mass through to our early Christian roots. Now, a disclaimer before we start this video. I appreciate that many of you who follow this channel will know a little bit about me and know that I am actually a practicing Roman Catholic who attends the Latin Mass. And my two colleagues have differing views on Christianity to me, and yet we work alongside each other very, very well, I think. The reason why I give that preface is because I can imagine that some of the responses that I will get to this, particularly from Catholic audience members, is that I am perhaps undermining the church or creating a more difficult position for Catholics to justify their beliefs. However, I don't think that this is necessarily the case in what I'm about to present. And I also think that it's important that as scholars, and two, for believers in one faith or another, to critically evaluate their positions throughout history and to refrain from saying things that fundamentally aren't true. However, it's ironic in some sense that in this video, the person I actually wish to criticize, or the comments I wish to criticize, I should say more specifically, are not from the Catholic, but from the Protestant in the video. So before I begin to expound a little bit on what I want to say, I think it's first appropriate to let the two speakers speak for themselves. And just as a bit of context, we are an hour and 48 minutes roughly into this video, and they are discussing the origins of early Christian liturgy and whether or not transubstantiation as a theology can be traced back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, etc. So keep an open mind, keep that in your mind, and if you want to go back and watch the rest of the debate, I will try and link it after the live stream is over. Here you go. Make of it what you will.
By the Council of Trent.
If people like Ignatius in 107 don't believe that the Mass is propitiatory, why is he calling it the medicine of immortality and the antidote to prevent us from dying, but the cause is that we should live forever in Jesus Christ?
Okay, we've only got 90 seconds here, but two things. If we have what Ignatius wrote, since I was in seminary, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, over the past 25 years, there has been a tremendous amount of skepticism, scholarly skepticism. Okay, let's make sure we don't. There we go. The light came back on. There has been a tremendous amount of scholarly skepticism expressed as to whether Ignatius even existed and which letters are actually, because there's a Latin and there's a shorter and I was not taught that, but I'm sort of catching up with that. So that I hope Ignatius wrote.
Moss and people like that are
I hope,
view, but it is a fringe view in scholarship.
I hope it's becoming the central view. I hope Ignatius existed and wrote the things we have. But I'm sorry.
You're saying the central view in scholarship is Ignatius.
I'm saying that the expression of that that there are people going, did these letters actually have an original form? There are so many forms of it. Why? That's not relevant to our debate right now. I'm simply saying. He may have written in 107 or 108. I hope he did, but maybe not. But
okay, let's just pause there for just a second and talk about ancient figures existing. Now, I really don't want to ignite a great debate either in the live stream or in the comments below around Jesus mythicism, because whenever that subject comes up, I find that the level of toxicity in the debate becomes very hot very quickly, and I find that sort of debate very difficult to engage with. However, on the subject of Ignatius mythicism, the comment you've heard there is that it's becoming the majority view of scholarship that Ignatius didn't exist. Can I affirm to you that that really is not becoming the majority position And indeed, the majority position, even amongst those scholars who begin to doubt some of the stories about Ignatius, and the reference is made there to Moss, they still largely accept, ironically, from my position, the 7 letters in their middle recension. Scholars are almost entirely still caught up in that idea of a middle recension based off the fantasies and assertions of William Cureton. Now, of course, there have been many great scholars who have argued against the 7 letters. Bauer, Hubner, and Vincent, and myself back in the back in the day, and Marcus and I more recently. And there have also been some who have at least insinuated that maybe Ignatius didn't even exist. And look, there's always going to be one, right? But let's be really clear that that statement that the majority of scholars do not believe Ignatius existed is Hello. Maybe we're back. The awkward silence where you're waiting. Okay, we're back. That's frustrating. The overwhelming majority is still that the middle recension of the 7 letters of Ignatius is true, and that the figure existed. Now, as I mentioned, you're always going to get a few people who do not believe a figure existed. And I'm open to that suggestion. But what we can't say something that's demonstrably untrue, which is that majority of scholars believe that. Now, I don't know, I assume many of you do know that I do believe Ignatius did exist. I believe it not just because he wrote some letters, or at least there are some letters with his name at the top, but also because he's made reference to by other figures. So Polycarp of Smyrna references him in his letter. Maybe once, maybe twice, I think personally once. We also get quotations from him in Irenaeus, in Origen, in Eusebius. And I think this, for me, is enough of a reason to think that he existed. Now, you might disagree with that, and that's fine, but it still makes this a disingenuous argument from our friend here, who is saying that the majority of scholars believe that he did not exist. Let's keep going.
What he's addressing, and what's very important, whenever it was written, some people are saying it was 150, something like that. Whatever he was addressing the influx of Gnosticism. And so his emphasis upon the medicine of immortality, they will not partake in the Eucharist. Why? Because they deny that Jesus Christ had a body of flesh and bones. He's arguing against the Docetists. To change that into an argument for transubstantiation is a huge abuse.
All right, that will conclude.
Now, that's essentially the end of where they get to in this particular discussion on Ignatius. Now, reference is made a little bit earlier to the various recensions and collections of Ignatius. And for those of you who, again, have followed this channel for a long time, you'll know the absolute complexity with which that scholars are faced with when it comes to the recensions of the letter collections of Ignatius. Even the idea of a short, a middle, a long recension, or a 3, a 7, and 13 or 15 letter collection is entirely erroneous and needs to be addressed. And it's only with a critical edition of the Ignatian epistles can maybe even begin to untangle this absolute disaster that is Ignatius of Antioch's letters. But I want to draw our attention to the idea again that methodology is really important here. And just because the situation is complex and messy does not mean it's irretrievable. We can almost certainly point to trends of an older version of a text, or at least an older strata of text, whether it be the original author Ignatius or the original author being someone else. We can argue about that maybe, but we can point to older and newer texts. And one of the issues that our Catholic friend then makes is by quoting all of the Ignatian material that supposedly speaks of what he calls a Eucharistic understanding that involves transubstantiation in the 2nd century. So both interlocutors are making really fundamental basic errors in their Ignatian scholarship, even before we begin to address the actual content. If we are talking about a middle recension of 7 letters, as the Catholic advocate does, he's made a mistake, because such a thing does not exist. If we are talking of the other fellow who says that, well, Ignatius doesn't exist according to the majority of scholars, and actually we don't really know, therefore forget about it anyway, that also is a misnomer. We can absolutely try to work out what the oldest strata of text is and try to date it. And also, we can recognize that it is very difficult to come across these things. Now, one of the main passages that the Catholic refers to is Ignatius's letter to the Ephesians, and in particular, chapter 20, which reads that Ignatius views, he tells us, the Eucharistic meal, or the bread of God, as the medicine of immortality, and that it brings eternal life. And he waxes lyrical about this throughout the Middle Recension. And almost all of these references to a Eucharistic understanding of communion are gone in the Short Recension. We are only left with one, which may or may not refer actually to communion, and that's in Romans chapter 7. Bear with me while I find it here. I do not desire the food of corruption, neither the desires of this world. The bread of God I seek, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, and his blood I seek, a drink which is love incorruptible. My spirit salutes you, and the love of the churches which receive me as the name of Jesus Christ. For even those who were near to the way in the flesh preceded me in every city. Okay. So that's the only, perhaps, interpretation thing we could draw out as being related to the Eucharist. Now, there's a few things I'd say about this. The first is the nature of this bread of God, which is, the flesh of Jesus Christ, which is the bread of God, which is love incorruptible. I have no doubt that many Catholics would seek to impose a transubstantiation metaphysic in the view of Aquinas onto this passage. And as a believer myself, part of me wants to do that because I want to see back into time the things that I now believe. But it's in no underestimation to say that this is an anachronistic understanding. One of the things that I term Ignatius of Antioch's theology is narrow and shallow. When we look at Ignatius, we need to stop reading into him great Greek philosophy, impressive medieval theology. He is ultimately, in the Three-Letter Collection, narrow and shallow, by which I mean he doesn't comment in any great depth of very many theologies. He doesn't sit there and pontificate about the beauty of the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and the mechanics of the cross and its place in salvation history as bringing about the redemption of humanity that was caused by Adam's fall, and the prophecies that are fulfilled in the person of Jesus. No. Ignatius in the Short Recension writes 3 letters. One to advise his friend, one to the Ephesians, basically as a thank you, and one to the Romans to stop them interfering or appealing on behalf of him to the Roman authorities to stop his execution. I have no doubt that Ignatius had some strong opinions about theology, practice, liturgy. One of them almost certainly being, I think, the bishopric. I think he has a very strong mono-episcopal understanding of church. Do I think that's original? Yes. Is he enigmatic and quite rare in that? Oh, totally. Polycarp doesn't understand him. Irenaeus doesn't understand him later. I think Ignatius has an entirely different view of Bishop than most of his contemporaries. And he also warns Polycarp that there are false teachers, and he warns them that they might come and give them false teachings to his parishioners, and that they need to stand strong against them like athletes who have been smitten. Yeah, fine, look, great. But he doesn't provide a great commentary of these theologies, expound upon them in depth one by one so that people might create other theological treatises. I mean, it's, again, not a radical position to say that I'm not sure we can deduce much of what Ignatius believes at all from his letters, except the fact that he knows that the only way he can attain to God, as he puts it, be made worthy of God, is to be killed. That's one of the few things that I can say with absolute certainty, that if Ignatius of Antioch existed, which I believe he did, he believed that was true. I also think we could say for sure that Ignatius believed in some sense that Jesus was the Son of God, perhaps, or maybe God himself. But again, to say too much more would be putting onto the text. If I say that he has a Trinitarian view of God, would be too much. That's me burdening Ignatius. This to say then, when we return back to Ignatius' letter to the Romans, chapter 7, the bread of God I seek, which is the flesh of Christ, and the blood I seek, a drink which is love incorruptible. I want to see transubstantiation. I want to believe that's true, but I can't burden him with that. On the subject of the removal of Eucharistic theology in Ignatius of Antioch's letters, I find it also really interesting here. One of the things I pick up on in my thesis is the nature of some of the things, according to the mainstream opinion, that were removed from the Middle Recension in the creation of the short. So scholars who accept the scholarly the consensus have to say that at the end of the 2nd century, someone, for one reason or another, and Lightfoot calls this a monk, ascetic monk, which I think is unbelievable conjecture. He says, look, someone just took this Middle Recension of 7 letters at the end of the 2nd century and took stuff out. There you go. But those things he was taking out, this editor, this redactor, not only includes Eucharistic theology, which, as we know, will become quite important and prevalent in later centuries, but also more unbelievable things like the resurrection, like references to the New Testament. That is unbelievable, yeah? That you would have a 2nd century Christian who removes these things. Whereas, if one accepts the position that Marcus and I and Mark Bilby and others are putting forward, that the short recension was found in a post-Irenaean era, where people were using the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, obviously, and, as Marcus pointed out, the Pauline epistles, which are inextricably linked with resurrection theology, well, then you can see why people might want to add those things in. That people said, Paul talks a lot about X or Y. The Gospels talk a lot about A and B. Ignatius doesn't mention any of them. Maybe we should put those in to create some form of coherent narrative. That, to me, seems like a far more plausible option. There is a third option. It's not one that I'm particularly enamored by, but I want to give it to you anyway because it's from a friend. Professor Alan Brent, who is a wonderful, wonderful church historian and has been a very close confidant of Marcus for a long time and has been a good friend to me as well, suggested to me that perhaps what was going on was that Ignatius was dictating these letters and that there were 2 amanuenses, secretaries, who are writing down the letters but include different things. As much as I like Alan, I think he is excellent, I do think this is perhaps untenable, but he will be publishing on it shortly, so do look out for it when it does come out. The second problem I have with some of the proponents of the Middle Recension is the narrative that goes around Ignatius. We've talked about it on several videos, whether it be with Ignatius or with Paul, about what I've termed waffle time, where these great stories begin to emerge about the martyr or about Paul, and the narrative becomes so great that it almost struggles to exist under its own pressure. It becomes such a big story. And the middle recension does this as well. Whereas in the short recension, we get very little about Ignatius' journey, where he was arrested, or where he's going. We just know that he's going to be killed in Rome, but we don't get much more than that. In the middle recension, we get more explanation of what's going on. We get his travel itinerary, as it were, which many have seen for a long time is almost certainly not genuinely Ignatian. And we get the people that he's with and the people that visit him. And somehow this martyr, who's being treated so dreadfully by these 10 lepers, as he calls them, or soldiers, allow him to receive great parties of Christians to soothe his journey, to give him respite. Which again, to me, seems entirely implausible, except when you begin to see that many of the names that are used in these extra portions are almost acting as hyperlinks, as Marcus Vincent pointed out in an article he wrote for Super Tristica in 2019, acting as hyperlinks from one letter to another to try and bind them all together. So, for example, in one letter, Ignatius will greet a friend, and then in another letter, he'll greet the same friend, as if to say, look, these are all connected. Whereas in the short recension, he greets nobody except Onesimus in the letter to the Ephesians. Fair enough, he's the bishop there. And Polycarp, in the letter to Polycarp, it'd be strange if he didn't greet him. So you see, there's so many questions around the evolution of these texts. And when people speak of them, as you have witnessed earlier on in this video, in that discussion, with such simplicity, either doubting the methodologies or imposing on the text and overburdening them with material, I think they have gravely mistaken what our role should be in assessing these texts. And if I might just finish, I think that one of the greatest cases of this, and it's been a lesson to me throughout my journey on Ignatius, comes from J.B. Lightfoot. Lightfoot, for those of you who don't remember or don't know, was the great Bishop of Durham, who wrote extensively on the Apostolic Fathers. And before his ascension to the episcopacy, he was a mere priest and scholar. And when William Cureton published in 1845 the short recension of Ignatius, Lightfoot, in a brief article, explained why he believed Cureton was correct. And that's really interesting, because only 20 years later, or 30 years later, my maths is bad, Lightfoot would become the greatest crusher of the Curetonian hypothesis, and get rid of it entirely. What changed for Lightfoot? Namely, predominantly, his ecclesial office. He went from being priest to bishop. And what was it that Ignatius defended so greatly in the middle recension, and to a lesser extent the short, but predominantly in the middle? The episcopacy. So too, we find a similar bias played out in the works of John Calvin, who naturally hated all that he read about threefold ecclesial hierarchies and possible Eucharistic interpretations and things of the like. And he said there is nothing more ridiculous than to believe that Ignatius of Antioch could have written these epistles, but yet provides not one shred of evidence for why we should doubt them. This approach is really unhelpful to early Christian scholarship, and it's one that I, despite being a believer, have tried to wrestle with. And when I came to Ignatius of Antioch in the middle recension in 2018, I was hook, line, and sinker sold out for them as genuine. And it's only after the assessment of the evidence that I've come to the opposite conclusion, that the short recension almost certainly contains an older version. Now, I want to do something just quite unusual. I've asked you to super chat your questions, but there's one comment here, Christian, that I do want to address, and that is Norelli has demonstrated that Ignatius's epistle is dependent on Paul's epistle in the opening. This is also valid for the shorter Syriac 3-letter correction of Ephesians. Again, not something I usually like doing, taking non-super chats, but I want to address this because it speaks to something that I entirely agree with Norelli, is that there is a dependency of the Ignatian epistles and Paul. But it depends what you mean by dependency and who is depending on who. One of the things that I'm currently tracking at the moment, and will only really bring to fruition after Marcus has finished his reconstruction and Mark has done more tests on the data of the Evangelion and the Apostolos, is to try and spot, and Marcus has already done this in part, try and spot more evidences for the progression into canonical texts from non-canonical texts. And I don't just mean here the ones that are in our canon. I mean the canonicalizing, or the words, theologies, themes, styles that happen as texts get older. So, for example, if we look at the Marcionite collection and its transformation into the canonical collection, what does that look like? If we look at the Evangelion becoming into one of the synoptics, particularly Luke, what does that look like? What things are added? How are words like baptism used? How are words like resurrection included? How is ritual or athletic imagery used? And where I agree with Norelli is that there is definitely a relationship between Paul's epistles and Ignatius's, but not in the way that you think it's going to be. I think that actually canonical Paul is using or gobbling up bits of Ignatius. I think that when you look at the Apostolos and compare it to Ignatius of Antioch in the 3-letter collection, we see no similarities at all. They don't know each other very much. It's also why I think that Ignatius' 3-letter collection is pre-Marcion, because he doesn't really show any knowledge of what Marcion is speaking of, or canonical New Testament, or of resurrection that Marcion then becomes a great fan of. We get none of that. Whereas a little bit later, when Marcion's being received, the resurrection becomes more into common conversation and flow. What happens to Ignatius? He gets middle recensioned. What's the middle recension have in common with the canon? Well, it goes through that same process. We start to see more of these canonical terms, more of these theologies, ideas, concepts, etc. And so, to my mind, I see that there's an Ignatius who exists, there's an Apostolos that exists, and an Evangelion. And then as we're moving towards a post-Justin Martyr world, and I know people always want a date here, but I don't want to give one because I think that's unhelpful at this moment in time. But in a post-Justin world, these texts are starting to all of a sudden be synthesized, or at least edited to corroborate one another and start expressing similar tones, thoughts, concepts. Whereas the opposite point of view, which is still the commonly consensus, is that all of these canonical texts and extracurricular canonical texts begin to fall away from having this unified voice, and people are separating them out and creating completely divergent opinions. And that to me seems really, really odd. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to join you for the past 29 minutes, and this was just an off-the-cuff video because I saw this interesting and lively debate, which I did enjoy, and I think a credit to both the participants for not being too toxic with one another. But I just wanted to go in and clarify just the bit that I could talk about on Ignatius. There was a comment also made to the Didache on the debate as well, in which they both argued for it to be very early, and perhaps I leave you with just that it almost in its final form certainly isn't. But more on the Didache to come. As always, it's been a pleasure. Please go down and click the links. If you're watching live, sorry, it'll just take me a minute to pop these down, these links. And also subscribe to Mark's channel, which I'll put a link to below. As always, have a good one. See you at the weekend. Bye-bye.